Hello, and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews brought to you by the Sci-Fi-Christian.com. I'm Ben DeBono, and I have finally finished my reread of A Clash of Kings. For those of you who've been paying attention for a while, I have read the Song of Ice and Fire series many times, but started rereading earlier this year, around the time Season 3 ended. Just kind of doing 1 or 2 chapters a day, so it's taking me a very long time, which is okay. I mean, I'm not in any hurry. In fact, the point of this reread isn't so much to get through the books, but to read it slower, to think about some of the things you might miss if you're going fast. So slow reading while I'm reading other stuff is not only what's occurring, but is actually the goal, part of the goal of this reread for me. In particular, if you watch the Game of Thrones review, you know that I spent a lot of time kind of talking about some of the literary critical elements of the series that you might miss as you're just blowing through it on your first read or second read to kind of figure out, okay, what's the next plot point going to be? You know, is Ned going to survive and all this stuff? And that's okay. I mean, that's a good way to read it for the first time. But a series like Game of Thrones, the best fantasy series, all are going to have this extra level of depth where the true test of them and of their quality is what happens when you read again and you already know everything that's going to happen, which at this point I read the early books. I've only read Dance with Dragons once, actually. I haven't reread that one since it came out, but all the other ones I've read 3-4 times before this. So I have a pretty good knowledge of everything that's going to happen. I mean, I forget little details here and there because obviously they're enormous books. But to me, what's fascinating and what keeps me coming back isn't the tension and adrenaline rush you get with these books and these stories the first time you read it or first time you're watching it if you're just a series viewer. It's more of the writing and deeper elements that George R.R. Martin has going on underneath the plot point, especially from a literary critical perspective, is a lot of what I've been paying attention to this time. So we'll talk about a few plot points that I found interesting on this reread in Clash of Kings, but then I also want to talk maybe a bit more about the literary critical stuff again to kind of keep our theme going from the Game of Thrones review. Same spoiler rules as I used in the first review. I will be spoiling through A Clash of Kings, which is the equivalent of Season 2 of the series, okay? So if you've watched just through Season 2 of the series, or you have only read the first 2 books, you will be okay. I will not go into details of things that happen in books 3 through 5. Now, next review, I'm afraid you series-only viewers are going to be out of luck because Series 3 is only the first half of A Storm of Swords. So next review, assuming I actually finish it before Season 4 comes out, which I hopefully will, we are going to be going beyond what has been in the show so far. But for now, if you've seen at least through Season 2, you are okay. Alright, so Clash of Kings. I'll be honest. Now, full disclaimer here. I love every one of these books. Okay, so what I'm about to say is relative to the series itself. All of these books, and every single one, 1 through 5, has been a 5-star book for me. They are that good, individually and as a whole. All of them are excellent. Far better than nearly everything else out there in contemporary fantasy. Okay, disclaimer. But within the series itself, relative to the series, A Clash of Kings might be my least favorite book. You know, it's probably down to that, or Feast for Crows, though, and again, without going into any details, I think Feast for Crows is a very misunderstood book. It's slower than any of the others. It is less entertaining than any of the others. But I think there's a lot of great stuff going on in that book that people have not given it credit for. So we'll get there, okay? You know, that's a couple reviews away still. But for people who, given what I just said, are saying, what about Feast for Crows? I just want to say, I hear you. I agree that Feast for Crows is in the bottom tier of the series, but I think it's still a great book and a very misunderstood one, okay? And the reason I might put Clash of Kings below it is I think that to a certain extent, and I noticed this both with the book and with season 2 of the series, that the story flounders a little bit, at least in the first part of Clash for Kings. You know, it is an ensemble cast, both in the series, both in the TV show and in the series. And it's always been like that, even in book 1. But in book 1, I think Ned really serves as a focal point, narratively. He is the main character in book 1. Certainly in the TV show, he was the main character. I mean, you had Sean Bean all over the marketing stuff for that. And so Ned Stark, not the only character, certainly not the only storyline. It's not like, you know, I'm trying to think of an alternate example and I'm blanking, but, you know, a novel where you have one character who's in virtually every scene of the book. That's not what we're talking about with the first book here, Game of Thrones. But Ned is the focal character. It's his story that's propelling everything forward. And even a lot of the alternate stories are all kind of centered on him. You know, we branch out from, everybody is kind of gathered together at Winterfell with him at the center, and we branch out from there. Really the only one that's super disconnected from him is Dany, and there is a little bit of cross-chatter between his story, and it becomes a point of tension between him and Robert in the first one. Even a story like Tyrion, and Tyrion goes pretty far afield from Ned. But, if you'll remember in the first book, when Catelyn kidnaps Tyrion, that is the impetus for Jaime showing up and having his battle with Ned that results in Ned's injury and yada yada yada. So even there, it's like this is another story that goes pretty far afield from Ned's, but still intersects with what's going on with him. So Ned is the narrative focal point of book 1. And he's gone, obviously, at the start of Clash of Kings. And while the writing is still really good, I do think that there's a bit of a struggle at times to figure out, okay, what do we do now without that central focal point, right? Because now we have a lot of interesting stories. I mean, Tyrion, obviously, if you do, to the extent that you do have a main character in this book, it's probably Tyrion. But everything I just described with Ned, where we can really trace nearly every story, with the possible exception of Dany, back to him as a central point from which everything flows out of and then ties back to a different point. That's not the case with Tyrion. I mean, there's tons of storylines going on that have nothing to do with Tyrion at this point. I mean, we have Jon up beyond the wall, we have everything that's going on with Bran, we have stuff with Theon, you know, all this stuff that really has nothing to do with Tyrion, who's probably our best shot at the main character. And I can't quite put my finger on why, but I do think that in some ways that makes the narrative a little bit harder to follow. I'm not sure what exactly changes around the halfway point of this book, and certainly in Storm of Swords this isn't a problem at all. And I would have to do an even closer reading to be able to tell you this is the difference. But I've had this sense reading this book, really felt this way about the first half of season 2 of the TV series. Again, this is all relative within the series. It's still a great book, but I do feel that the first half of this book flounders just a little bit. And then, of course, things start to come together. We really get our storylines rolling, and it becomes, if there is something I could maybe point to as a theory, I think it's just that as we're moving on from Ned as the focal point, maybe it just takes some time for some of these storylines to get rolling independent of Ned, for us to get used to not having him there. I don't know, but for whatever reason, the story does start rolling quite a bit, and we get some excellent stuff throughout the series, or throughout the book. Especially the Battle of Blackwater. Now, this is the second plot point that I want to talk about a little bit before I get into some of the literary critical stuff I noticed this time. I might be betraying my fellow book fans here, but I think the series, the TV show, did the Battle of Blackwater better than the books. Now, let me explain that not in everything okay? I really missed the chain. I wish they would have found a way to have put that into the TV show. It would have been better if it was there. And a second disclaimer, since George R.R. Martin wrote the Blackwater episode for the TV series, this isn't really a criticism of him. I mean, I'm comparing George R.R. Martin to George R.R. Martin, so he's a genius either way. But I do feel that on the TV show, the Battle of Blackwater is easier to follow. Here's why, as I was thinking about it. You have an extremely complicated battle that's going on here. There's a lot of different moving pieces. And I think that in this case, it's one of the very, very few places where the structure of the books, where we go from POV chapter to POV chapter to POV chapter, and we never break the point of view of the chapter we're on. So if it's a Tyrion chapter, it's all from Tyrion's perspective. And if it's a Jon chapter, it's all from Jon's perspective. Okay. I think that's one of the few places where that structure hurts the book a little bit. In the TV show, you have the benefit from jumping from character to character to character during the Battle of Blackwater as it is most narratively fulfilling, as it best serves the plot. Martin doesn't have that same freedom in the books because of how he set it up. If he starts on Tyrion for a portion of the battle, he needs to stick with Tyrion until that chapter is complete. Okay, and since he's not the type of guy who, a la James Patterson, writes a 2-page chapter and then decides to go on, no, when he writes chapters, he's trying to tell a fulfilling mini story within the book. Okay, so because of that, he sticks with the chapters for a while. We don't move on right away. And at times, that makes what is already a really confusing battle, arguably the most confusing battle and complex battle that we actually see on screen in either the books or the show. I mean, we see a lot of battles that happen off screen from where our point of view characters are, but this is probably the most convoluted that happens on screen, if you will. It makes a complicated battle that much more complicated. Now again, this is all relative to the series. I'm maybe nitpicking a little bit because I do tend to praise these books so much. But I do think that this is one area where the TV show did it better. Blackwater, which I have declared and will stand by, even in the face of some of these amazing Breaking Bad episodes we've been getting in the final season, that Blackwater is the single greatest episode of television ever produced. I will stand by that. I think it's amazing what they pulled off there. Absolutely incredible. Okay, so those are kind of the plot things I wanted to touch on for this one. Let's talk literary criticism for a second, because again, I think that's a lot of what George R.R. Martin is trying to do in these books. Here's what I noticed this time. I think that if you were to ask most fans of the books, including myself, who is your least favorite character to read about? Okay, so which point of view character, when you see his or her name at the heading of the chapter, just kind of makes you go, oh no, we gotta suffer through one of these chapters. I think a lot of people are gonna say Sansa. Sansa is at or near the bottom of most fans' lists for their favorite characters. You know, you've got at the top, you got people like Tyrion and Jon, you know, and then you get few detractors for somebody like Catelyn. She'll, you know, a lot of people defend her, a lot of people rag on her, but Sansa seems to be nearly universally disliked, okay? From a plot point, that's correct. If you're reading these books for the first time, Sansa is by and large the least interesting of the point of view chapters. Almost always. She, you know, tends to be a little bit whiny, which isn't as interesting. You know, the big things don't happen with her. We don't get the wit that we get with Tyrion. She's a lot less likable than Arya, you know, and so on it goes. It's just, again, I think it's all relative to the series. It's not that she's bad or that her chapters are poorly written, but within the series, from an excitement, I gotta know what happens next. Sansa, you know, she's the one where it's 12:30, 1 o'clock at night, and you're debating with yourself, should I read the next chapter? And you flip the page and you see Sansa. That's kind of a decision maker. It's like, yeah, I can wait till tomorrow to read this one. I'll get some sleep. Whereas if you flip the page, you see Tyrion, it's like, okay, I can spare another 15, 20 minutes to get through the next chapter because I gotta know what happens to Tyrion. But not Sansa. Okay, but from a literary critical perspective, Sansa is one of the most fascinating characters in this series. Okay? I mentioned last time how part of the genius of Game of Thrones is the way that Martin takes our expectations for how a fantasy series is supposed to go. At least expectations circa mid-1990s. Obviously, so many people have copied him now, the kind of killing characters and going morally gray and ambiguous. That's kind of become the new cliche. But back in the 90s, that wasn't the case at all. So Martin doing what he did, having this main character of Ned Stark, killing him and leaving only morally ambiguous characters in his wake, was huge, okay? And that completely played against our expectations. Sansa's our stand-in within the series. Because she's the one who, even though she's living in this horrible, morally gray world, expects it to work a certain way. She has Ned's naivety amplified by 1,000. Okay, we see that really clearly in the first book. But now we get to book 2, and Sansa's character is so tragic because that naivety, which is so dangerous in this world, but yet also so charming. You want her to be able to believe, to actually live in the world she thinks she lives in, and she doesn't. And that's so tragic to see her realize that, where Joffrey goes from her darling prince, who she thinks he's going to be in book 1, to the murderer of her father, to now her own personal torturer in book 2, where he's ordering his guards to beat her. And then even her protector, you know, the closest thing she gets to a prince is Tyrion, who's not the handsome, I'm going to rescue, you fair maiden. In fact, she's not even sure she can trust him because he's still a Lannister. What's his game? And so we see the complete breakdown of Sansa throughout this book, which from a plot perspective might not be that interesting to us. Oh, come on, where's the sex, where's the violence? We want the next big character death, we want the next big plot twist, we want to see Blackwater. But from a literary critical perspective, what we're watching is a character who is essentially going through the same process that we are, coming to a fantasy series with a certain set of expectations about how things are going to go, realizing those expectations don't apply, and then trying to figure out what that means to be reading a book, or in Sansa's case, living your life in such a morally ambiguous world. The difference, of course, is that, well, a lot of us were, so bored by David Eddings, Terry Brooks fantasy that we get to this, we welcome this brilliant shift. For Sansa, it's absolute hell. It's not something she welcomes. So there, it still works from a literary critical perspective, but this time, from that perspective, it works almost as juxtaposition. For Sansa, this is hell. For us, it's, yes, we finally don't have stupid cliched fantasy anymore. And I think that also works as maybe reader criticism from the author. What does that say about us, Is that a good thing? Well, yeah, no. I mean, obviously, it's good in the sense that nobody likes to read cliched reading. I don't recommend Terry Brooks to anyone anymore. I got over that around age 18 or whatever. But it's also, is there a bad part to that? Is it bad that we lose that innocence that lets us simply be entertained by heroic characters? Is it bad that we need and long for the morally ambiguous? I don't know. I don't know, but I think that those are questions worth thinking about. So there's a unique twist for you there. Maybe Game of Thrones is actually a moralistic lecture against liking moral ambiguity. Probably not, but it's just an interesting reading that that's encouraging or occurring to me as I'm talking to you about this. That I think if you really focus on Sansa as the character who is our stand-in for the process we go through as we adjust to this new type of fantasy, the fantasy that breaks out of the Tolkien mold, that completely obliterates the cheesy, cliched, dull Tolkien ripoffs of the 80s and early 90s and 70s as well. What does that say about us? What does that say about literature? What does that say about the genre and what we're becoming? Okay? And I think it's important that Martin has left this character in the series, despite the fact that fans don't like her. I think it's important that we take time to really absorb what's going on with Sansa in the chapters and use it to think about what is going on within literary trends. So here I'll go really meta, within literary trends outside of Game of Thrones, right? Because Game of Thrones, within the fantasy genre, has launched a revolution, but it's a revolution that's also reflected in culture as a whole, you know, the movement from modernism to postmodernism. We've come to really question what it means to be heroic. Do we really believe in the concept of heroes? Do archetypal characters have anything of value to say to us? What do we do then with great literature like Lord of the Rings, which is far more archetypal than something you're going to get in the moral ambiguity of Game of Thrones? How do we wrestle with all those questions? So I think that if you, like me in the past, have read these books, gotten to Sansa and kind of grown, okay, go back and reread them. You already know what's going to happen. You don't need the next big plot point. And take time to really absorb what Martin is doing with Sansa's chapters, especially in Clash of Kings. Because Clash of Kings is post Ned's death, and that is the turning point. That's when the series, certainly we have moral ambiguity before that in the series, but that's when the series effectively kills its archetypal hero and moves into a very different world than anything we've ever seen before, circa 1990s, in the fantasy genre. And Sansa's character, as she's processing what that means for her, we ought to be processing what that means for us as readers, as people living in the postmodern world, as people dealing with literary changes, as people who seek to read stories as something meaningful to say about us, culture, life, philosophy, etc. Okay? So that's my plug for Sansa. I think she is not a great character from a plot perspective, but an extraordinarily important character within this series, and one that has a lot to say to us. So, Clash of Kings, great book as always. Can't wait to reread Storm of Swords, my favorite of the series, though that one's very long, so don't look for that review anytime soon, but when I finish it, I will be back to you with that one. But for now, I'm Ben Bono, and this is the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews. Goodbye.